This is the new AC Delco compressor, complete with clutch, that I installed on my 1997 S-10 truck that I bought new in 1997. On this truck, it's very easy to remove the old compressor. Just loosen the bolt at the lines, remove the lines, of course after the Freon has been captured. Disconnect the clutch electrical connector and the 4 bolts that hold the compressor. And note that some of these compressors have a switch on the back. You may have to disconnect that if yours has it. Just curious why the old compressor failed, and this is the 3rd one since the truck was new. So I took the compressor apart just out of curiosity, and it failed from a lack of oil. The Teflon rings on the pistons had started to seize in the bore, had scored the bore, so nothing about the old compressor could be reused, and it burnt the clutch up when it started slipping. I was on the road, and there was no warning of this when it locked up and the clutch burned up. No smell of smoke or anything since I was going 60 on the highway. But I thought the transmission was shifting funny, but that wasn't the problem. When I got home, I saw that the compressor had locked up. So it was trying to lock up, making it surge, putting a load on the engine. My compressor had a pressure switch at the rear, and you can see the connector here behind the compressor mounting plate. The pressure switch is on the left, retained by a snap ring. So you remove your old pressure switch with snap ring pliers, lubricate the switch, push it back in using the same O-ring, and put your snap ring back in place, as shown here. I have removed the accumulator, also called a receiver dryer. Always replace the accumulator when you replace the compressor. Very good idea to do so. I poured in 5 ounces of PAG oil into the accumulator before I installed the accumulator. Many might disagree, but how often to add oil, how much oil to add is all an educated guess, really. Because the rubber lines are porous to some degree, you will lose Freon over a period of time. And it usually means that you're losing some oil too. So 10 years ago, when I replaced the last compressor, all the oil was gone this time. And I'm sure I added oil 10 years ago. I always do. You'll need a tool like this to remove the clutch plate. You can use a bearing spreader shown here to remove that clutch coil. That is one option. Once you have the clutch coil pulled away a little bit with screwdrivers, like I mentioned previously, you can use a puller like this if you have one, but you have to use the little adapter shown right above it, because you cannot press on the compressor shaft. This is the tool used to press that clutch hub back on, and you can see that there's a bearing right next to the clutch plate, drive plate, and that screws on to the compressor shaft, and you force the plate back on with your key, of course, installed by turning the nut. Now this clutch coil has really been overheated, but an ohms check showed it to be good, so I'm saving that. Clutch coils used to be retained by a large snap ring, but some of the later models now have it pressed on, just to save a little bit of money from not having to use a snap ring. Of course, that just makes it harder to remove. The easiest way to break this clutch coil loose without special tools is to use 2 screwdrivers and drive in equally on both sides of the coil, and it will break loose. Then you can use a bearing separator tool if you have one, or you could use a puller if you have one. In this case, a puller worked just fine. But you want to press against the air conditioning compressor housing and not the shaft. Never press on the shaft to remove a clutch coil. Another view of that overheated clutch coil, and I had an old compressor that had a good clutch coil on it, and I saved that for future use. And here are the special sealing washers for the air conditioning lines on the compressor. These probably will come with your new compressor. They did with mine. This is AC Delco or Delphi, but it is made in China like everything else anymore. The red plug's on the inlet and outlet of the accumulator, and the black cap is over where the pressure switch will go. The new accumulator will come with new O-rings. Lubricate them, of course. There is a pressure switch to the right on the accumulator, and there also is a Schrader valve, so you can remove this pressure switch anytime with the system fully charged and not lose Freon. It has an O-ring too, by the way. Always lubricate O-rings with refrigerant oil, being as clean as a surgeon. Removing the orifice tube is a little hard to get to on this S-10. You don't always have to replace that orifice tube. It can be cleaned. But anytime you have the system down for major repairs, check that orifice tube as well. It has a screen filter on it. You can clean it. Always try to use tubing wrenches if you have them. Tubing crow's foot wrenches too if you have them, or hard to get to lines. And here is where the orifice tube goes at the bottom of the evaporator. The orifice tube serves the same purpose as the old expansion valve did. And replace the orifice tube O-ring if you have one. If not, you might be able to reuse your old one. And this is an orifice tube removing tool, which is great to have. But if you don't have that, you might can use needle nose to grab the end of that orifice tube. And before I had this orifice tube removing tool, I have used a sheet metal screw to carefully remove the old orifice tube if it was really stuck, and I have had them really stuck. But you have to be so careful not to damage that evaporator. Last resort. One extreme case years ago, I actually had to heat that evaporator tube to get the orifice tube out. That really made me nervous, but was the only option, unless you wanted to remove the evaporator core. And this is my Everco recycling machine that I used to pull a vacuum before I added the R134. And here is the old compressor with the clutch coil and clutch removed. I wanted to take it apart to see what caused this compressor to fail, and like I say, it had no oil. When the compressor locked and the clutch plate started to slip, it overheated the bearing, ruined the bearing in the pulley. And this is a snap ring that retains the clutch assembly on some of the AC Delco compressors that don't use the press-on clutch coil. And here is some information that might be helpful to you. Pull a vacuum and recharge with 134 and you should be good to go. Good luck.